It was a bright morning when the letter came. Helen had been waiting for it for 2 long years. She ran outside, clutching the envelope, her heart pounding with excitement. "Mama, Papa, I got in. I'm going to the university," she screamed at the top of her lungs. Her parents froze for a moment before bursting into shouts of joy. Her father lifted her off her feet, spinning her around, while her mother's eyes filled with happy tears. The house was alive with laughter, hugs, and dancing. That day was like a dream come true. Little did they know, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The week Helen was set to leave for school was bittersweet. Her bags were packed neatly, clothes folded, foodstuffs carefully tucked away, and her dreams bigger than ever. As she stood by the door, ready to say goodbye, her mother called her back. "Helen, my child," her mother said gently, holding her hand tightly. "You are the pride of this family. Remember, we are a decent family. Guard your heart and protect yourself. Always stay on the right path." "Yes, Mama," Helen said with a firm nod, tears glistening in her eyes. "I won't let you down." Her mother smiled faintly, but looked into Helen's eyes one last time. "Promise me you'll keep your dignity, your purity, until marriage." "I promise, Mama," Helen whispered. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder. "Go and make us proud, Helen." With those words, Helen left for the university, her heart full of hope. Life at university was a whole new world. Helen quickly adjusted to her classes and made a few friends. But something strange began to happen. Whenever she walked across campus, heads would turn. People stared at her, some with admiration, others with envy. She heard the whispers. "She's so beautiful," some said. Boys found excuses to talk to her, offering help with her books, trying to sit next to her in lectures, and complimenting her at every chance. One afternoon, as Helen stood outside the library, flipping through her notes, a tall, confident boy approached her. "Hi, I'm Michael," he said with a grin. "You must be Helen. Everyone talks about how beautiful you are." Helen gave him a polite smile. "Thank you, but I need to get back to studying." Michael was persistent. "Come on, I'm not asking for much. Let's grab coffee, just as friends." Helen shook her head firmly. "I'm sorry, but I'm not interested." It wasn't just Michael. Day after day, more boys tried to get her attention. Some were charming, others wealthy, but Helen stayed true to her promise. She avoided them all, focusing on her studies. One evening, in a small, cozy hostel room at the university, Helen and her best friend, Mercy, sat on their beds after a long day of classes. Mercy, who had been Helen's closest friend since the very first day of school, tossed her bag to the side and looked at Helen with a mischievous grin. "Helen," she said, breaking the silence, "don't you think it's a little strange?" Helen raised an eyebrow, sitting up. "Strange? What's strange?" Mercy leaned closer, lowering her voice as if she were about to reveal a big secret. "It's weird that you're 20 years old, in your second year of university, and still a virgin. And you don't even have a boyfriend." Helen burst into laughter. "Mercy, that's not weird. And trust me, I'm not the only virgin in this school." Mercy rolled her eyes dramatically. "Okay, maybe you're not the only virgin, but you're definitely the only beautiful virgin. Have you even seen yourself in the mirror? Helen, you're stunning. Sometimes I wonder how you even managed to finish secondary school without a boyfriend. And now, here you are, almost in your final year, and you're still, you know." Helen smiled warmly at her friend. "Mercy, I come from a very strict and religious family. Growing up, my parents didn't even let me go out alone. I couldn't just hang out with anyone anytime. That's how I was raised." Mercy nodded, but her expression showed disbelief. "I get it, but still, don't you feel like you're missing out? I mean, people here go on dates, have fun, experience love. Doesn't it bother you that you've never even had a boyfriend?" Helen shook her head firmly. "No, Mercy. I promised my parents that I would keep my body pure. When I was younger, I didn't think much about it, but when I came to the school and people started complimenting me, I realized how beautiful I am. But I also realized how important my promise is. I don't want to let my parents down." Mercy chuckled, lying back on her bed. All right, Madam Virgin. I wish you good luck with all that, but I still think you're missing out on so much. Don't say I didn't warn you. Helen laughed softly and threw a pillow at Mercy. I'm fine, Mercy. Trust me. I'm not missing anything. It was a warm afternoon when Helen walked back from her classes. As she walked past a large tree near the school gate, she noticed a group of boys sitting under it. They were laughing loudly and making noise as they always did. Helen knew them. Everyone did. They were troublemakers, known to be part of a dangerous group in school. She quickened her steps, hoping to avoid them. Hey, Helen, one of them called out. She pretended not to hear and kept walking. Hey, we're talking to you, another voice shouted. Helen's heart raced. She walked faster, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. But before she could get far, two of the boys ran after her. One grabbed her arm roughly, stopping her in her tracks. Are you not the one we're calling? He said, glaring at her. Why are you acting like you didn't hear us? Helen's voice trembled as she spoke. I'm sorry. I'm rushing somewhere. Please let me go. The boy smirked. No, you can't go. My friend over there wants to talk to you. Follow me now. Helen pulled her hand back, fear creeping into her voice. I don't want to follow you. Please leave me alone. But the boy held her arm tighter. Don't make me drag you there, he said. Just as Helen was about to scream for help, someone stepped in. Hey, let her go. The voice was firm and commanding. Helen and the boys turned to see Ben, a final year student, standing a few steps away. He was tall, confident, and well-known in school. Mind your business, Ben, one of the boys said, annoyed. Ben didn't back down. I said, let her go, he repeated, his eyes fixed on them. The boys hesitated, then slowly released Helen's arm. You'll regret this, Ben, one of them muttered before walking away with his friend. Ben was in his final year at the university. He wasn't just good-looking, he was smart, confident, and respected by both students and lecturers. Everyone knew Ben, but he wasn't the kind of guy who bragged about it. The week after he stood up for Helen against the troublesome boys, Helen spotted him near the library. She was nervous, but decided to walk up to him. Hi, Ben, she said softly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Ben turned and smiled warmly. Helen, hi. How are you? I just wanted to thank you for helping me that day, she said. I don't know what I would have done without you. Ben chuckled. It was nothing. I couldn't let them treat you like that. They talked for a few minutes, and before leaving, Ben said, if you ever need help, don't hesitate to call me. He handed her his number, and Helen saved it on her phone. From that day on, Helen and Ben grew closer. Whenever Helen had a problem, whether it was a tough assignment or dealing with something personal, she would call Ben. He was always there to listen and offer advice. Soon, they were spending more and more time together. They walked to class, shared meals, and studied together. Helen felt safe with Ben, and Ben found Helen's company refreshing. One day, Helen had a particularly challenging assignment that she couldn't figure out. She called Ben, and he invited her to his house so they could work on it together. That evening, Helen arrived at Ben's house with her books. They sat at the table, their heads bent over the assignment. Ben patiently explained the parts she didn't understand, and Helen began to feel more confident. Time flew by, and before they realized it, the clock struck 10 p.m. Helen stood up, gathering her books. It's late. I should get back to the hostel. Ben frowned. Helen, it's too late for you to walk back alone. It's not safe. I'll be fine, she insisted. But Ben shook his head. Please stay. You can sleep on the bed, and I'll take the couch. I don't want anything to happen to you. Helen hesitated, but she knew he was right. Okay, she said quietly. That night, as they lay in the same room, Helen on the bed and Ben on the couch, they began talking. They shared stories about their childhood, their dreams, and their fears. Ben sat up after a while and looked at her. Helen, you're really special, he said softly. Helen smiled, but before she could respond, Ben leaned over and kissed her. Helen's heart raced. She didn't know how to feel, but before she realized it, she was kissing him back. The kiss deepened, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. But suddenly, Helen pulled away. "I can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ben looked startled. "I'm sorry, Helen. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "It's okay," she said quickly, standing up. "I just need to go." Ben reached out to her but stopped himself. "You don't have to leave. Please stay on the bed. I'll sleep on the couch, I promise." Helen hesitated, then nodded. She climbed back into the bed, her heart still pounding. That night, she lay awake, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. The next day, Helen decided to avoid Ben. She felt embarrassed and confused about what had happened. She didn't answer his calls or reply to his texts. Days turned into a week, and Helen still avoided him. But Ben wasn't one to give up easily. One afternoon, he showed up at her hostel. Mercy, Helen's roommate, was sitting outside when Ben approached her. "Hi, Mercy. Is Helen around?" Mercy looked at him and smiled. "No, she's not here right now. But she'll be back soon." "Thanks. I'll wait," Ben said, sitting down. When Helen returned and saw Ben in her room, her heart skipped a beat. She froze for a moment, then walked in slowly. "Hi, Helen," Ben said softly. Helen didn't reply. She sat on her bed, avoiding his gaze. After a long silence, Ben finally spoke. "Helen, why have you been avoiding me?" Helen looked down, unable to answer. Ben took a deep breath. "Helen, I've been thinking about this for a while. I care about you. I think I'm in love with you." Helen's heart raced. She looked up at him, her eyes wide. "I don't want to lose you," Ben continued. "Will you be my girlfriend?" Helen was silent for a long time, her mind racing. Finally, she said, "Okay, Ben. I'll date you." Ben's face lit up, but before he could say anything, Helen added, "But there's one condition." "Anything?" Ben said quickly. "No sex," she said firmly. "Not until I'm ready." Ben nodded. "I promise, Helen. I'll wait for as long as it takes." And so, their love story began. Helen and Ben were inseparable. They studied together, ate together, and shared their lives with each other. Rumors began to spread across campus about their relationship. "Have you heard? Helen and Ben are dating," people whispered. Helen didn't care about the rumors. She was happy, and that was all that mattered. 5 months passed, and their relationship blossomed. Ben kept his promise, never pressuring her for anything she wasn't ready for. One bright sunny afternoon when Helen and Mercy decided to head to the market. They walked along the busy school road, laughing and chatting about what they would cook for dinner. Suddenly, the sound of screeching tires made them stop in their tracks. A sleek, shiny car rolled to a stop right in front of them. The car sparkled under the sun, and Helen could see her reflection in its glossy surface. Slowly, the door opened, and out stepped a tall, handsome man dressed in expensive clothes. His shoes shone, and his watch glimmered in the sunlight. "Hello, ladies," the man said with a charming smile. His deep voice was smooth like honey. He looked directly at Helen. "What's your name, beautiful?" he asked, his gaze never leaving her face. Helen frowned and shook her head. "I'm sorry, but I don't want to talk to you," she said firmly. The man's smile didn't waver. "I'm Frank," he said confidently. "I'd like to have your number so we can talk later." "I'm not interested," Helen replied, her voice steady. Frank's smile faltered for just a moment, but then he turned to Mercy. "All right, if she won't give me her number, maybe you can give me yours." Mercy, feeling a bit flustered, hesitated before quickly giving him her number. Frank saved it in his phone, flashed one last smile at Helen, and got back into his car. As the car drove off, Mercy looked at Helen with wide eyes. "Helen, do you know who that was?" "That's Frank. He's one of the richest guys in town." Helen shrugged. "I don't care how rich he is. I'm not interested." Days passed. Frank began calling Mercy, asking her to help him talk to Helen. "Please, Mercy," Frank said one evening. "I really like Helen. I just want a chance to get to know her better." Mercy sighed and agreed to talk to Helen. That night, she turned to her friend. "Helen," Mercy began cautiously, "Frank asked me to talk to you. He really likes you and wants to get to know you." Helen didn't even look up from her book. "I'm not interested, Mercy," she said firmly. "But Helen," Mercy pressed, "he's handsome, rich, and so charming. Don't you even want to give him a chance?" Helen shook her head. "I have been. I don't need anyone else." One early morning, Helen woke up to find something unusual in her room. At first, she thought she was dreaming, but when she sat up, she saw them clearly boxes of beautiful gifts stacked neatly in her room. There were designer bags, shiny new shoes, perfumes, chocolates, and a bouquet of fresh red roses. Mercy, who was just waking up, gasped when she saw the gifts. "Where did these come from?" Helen asked, confused. Mercy quickly grabbed her phone. A few moments later, she turned to Helen with an excited smile. "It's Frank. He sent them. He called me earlier and asked me to pick them up from the hostel gate before he left." Helen stared at the gifts, unsure of how to feel. "Why would he do this?" "I told him I'm not interested," she said quietly. Mercy, however, was overjoyed. "Helen, don't you see? He really likes you. No guy would go to this length if he wasn't serious." Helen shook her head, but before she could say more, the door to their room swung open and a group of girls walked in. The girls had heard about the gifts and came to see for themselves. They crowded around the room, admiring the beautiful items Frank had sent. "Wow, Helen, you're so lucky," one of them exclaimed, holding up a designer bag. "I've heard about Frank," another girl said. "No woman can say no to him. He's so handsome and rich. Do you know how many girls would kill to be in your shoes right now?" Another chimed in. Helen sat quietly on her bed, watching the girls gush over the gifts. She didn't say a word, but a small smile played on her lips. Inside, she felt conflicted. She didn't want Frank, but his persistence and the reaction from everyone around her made her feel something she couldn't quite explain. Helen finally gave in to meeting Frank. At first, she told herself it was just to keep the peace, but soon she started enjoying his company. Frank was charming, confident, and generous. He picked her up in his sleek car, took her to fancy restaurants, and treated her like a queen. Whenever Frank dropped Helen off at her hostel, the girls would rush to their windows or step outside, staring in awe. They whispered and gossiped, wishing they could be in her shoes. Helen was now the envy of the entire hostel. Over time, Helen's life changed completely. Frank spoiled her with gifts, designer clothes, expensive shoes, and the latest gadgets. Money was no longer a problem for her. She started eating at the best places, wearing the fanciest outfits, and living large. But as her life with Frank became brighter, her relationship with Ben started to fade. At first, Helen didn't notice it much, but soon, she found herself ignoring Ben's calls. She didn't reply to his texts and avoided running into him on campus. One day, Ben called her over and over again, but Helen never picked up. Instead, she sent him a short text message. "Ben, I think it's better we go our separate ways. I've found someone else. I'm sorry." Ben read the message and couldn't believe it. His heart broke into a million pieces. Meanwhile, that same day, Helen said yes to being Frank's girlfriend. Helen's new relationship felt like a dream. Frank made her feel like she was living in paradise. He took her shopping at the most expensive stores and bought her whatever she wanted. He introduced her to a world of parties, clubs, and late-night outings. But with all the fun came consequences. Helen started skipping lectures and falling behind in her studies. Frank, however, began pressuring her for something more. "Helen," he would say, "I've done so much for you. Don't you think it's time to show me how much you love me?" Helen was uncomfortable, but she didn't want to disappoint Frank. She felt that, after everything he had done for her, she owed him something in return. One evening, Frank invited Helen to his place. They had dinner, laughed, and talked like usual. But that night, Frank was more affectionate than ever. He kissed Helen and whispered sweet words into her ear. Helen hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but Frank continued to assure her. "I love you, Helen," he said. "You're the only one for me. Don't you trust me?" After a long pause, Helen nodded. She convinced herself that it was the right thing to do. That night, Frank took her virginity. The next morning, just as the sun was rising, Frank woke Helen up. "I have to leave town for urgent business," he said. "You should go back to your hostel. I'll call you later." Helen was confused. Frank had never asked her to leave his place before. She wanted to ask questions, but decided not to argue. Quietly, she got dressed and left. As soon as Helen walked out the door, Frank sprang into action. He pulled the bedsheet off the bed, the same one stained with Helen's blood from the night before. He carefully cut out the part with the bloodstain, folded it neatly, and placed it in a bag. He then packed a few clothes, locked up his house, and drove off. Frank traveled to a remote village, far from the city. He parked his car outside a small, eerie-looking hut surrounded by tall trees. Inside the hut was an old man, a native doctor, sitting cross-legged on the floor. The man had strange markings on his face and a large pot bubbling in front of him. Frank handed the blood-stained cloth to the native doctor. "This is what you asked for," he said. The native doctor took the cloth, sniffed it, and began chanting strange words. His voice grew louder and more intense as he threw herbs into the bubbling pot. The room filled with smoke, and the air felt heavy. Helen felt unusually tired that day and decided to skip her classes. She stayed in bed all day, trying to shake off the strange heaviness in her body. By night, she fell into a deep sleep. In her sleep, Helen had the most terrifying dream. A huge snake slithered toward her. She tried to run, but it wrapped itself around her. The snake hissed and stared into her eyes before it did something she couldn't even comprehend. It made love to her. Helen felt trapped and helpless. Suddenly, she woke up with a jolt, drenched in sweat. But as she sat up, she noticed something horrifying. Her bed was crawling with maggots. They were everywhere, and to her shock, they were gushing out of her private part. Helen screamed so loudly it woke her roommate, Mercy. Mercy turned on the lights, saw the horrifying sight, and screamed too. Their cries of terror filled the hostel, and other students rushed into their room to see what was happening. The students gathered around, staring in shock and confusion. Some were shouting, others whispered to each other, and a few even pulled out their phones to record what was happening. Helen, crying and in pain, begged for help. She kept shaking her head and holding her stomach as Mercy tried to comfort her, but nothing was working. The maggots kept pouring out, and the smell filled the room. Soon, the school security was called. They cleared the crowd and carried Helen out of the hostel. The girls in the hostel stood outside, some crying, some too scared to speak. Helen was taken home that night. Her parents were horrified when they saw her condition. The maggots had stopped coming out, but Helen was in a worse state. She couldn't speak a word. Her eyes were open, but she seemed like she was in a daze. Her father shouted, "Helen, talk to me. What is wrong with you?" But Helen didn't respond. Her mother held her hand, crying uncontrollably. The next day, they rushed her to the hospital. The doctors examined her and tried everything they could, but Helen didn't show any signs of improvement. After 5 days with no change, one of the doctors called her parents aside. "I think this is beyond medical help," the doctor said gently. "You may need to take her to a church. She needs prayers." Desperate for a solution, Helen's parents carried her to a well-known church. The pastor, a kind but firm man, looked at Helen with deep concern. "We'll pray for her tonight," he said. "God will reveal what is happening." That night, the pastor and his prayer team surrounded Helen and prayed nonstop. They prayed with all their might, calling on God to break whatever evil was tormenting her. As the clock struck midnight, Helen suddenly let out a loud cry and began shaking. The prayer team continued, shouting, "Come out of her in Jesus' name." By morning, Helen opened her eyes and sat up. For the first time in days, she spoke. "Frank," she whispered. Her parents and the pastor leaned in closer. "Frank? What about Frank?" her father asked. Helen started crying as she explained everything, how she had chosen Frank over Ben, how he pressured her into giving up her virginity, and the dream she had about the snake. Helen's father immediately tried calling Frank, but his number was switched off. They called him repeatedly over the next few days, but there was no response. Meanwhile, Helen's health slowly improved, but she was no longer the same. She felt broken inside, filled with regret. She couldn't believe how far she had fallen. Helen had to take a year off from school to recover. She missed her graduation and watched her classmates move on without her. Sitting at home one day, she told her mother, "I regret everything, Mama. I wish I never met Frank. I wish I had listened to you and stayed true to myself." Her mother hugged her tightly. "It's okay, my child. What matters is that you've learned. God has given you another chance. Use it wisely."